So for today's material, what I want to do is I want to give you a very sort of concrete, logical way to see how your thoughts are impacting your life. And for many of you, this is probably not going to be a new idea or a new concept, right? I think probably on an intellectual level, we can easily see how our thoughts are impacting your life. But this particular sort of model or framework that I want to walk you through is very useful in the sense that it helps you sort of break down the process. And when we break down the process of how we get from a thought to a result in our life, it's much easier for us to sort of step into the process and interrupt it. And that is where we really can start to see results, is when we can interrupt the thought patterns and create new thought patterns. And it's much easier to do that when you have a sort of logical framework to start from. And so that is really what I want to go with. Now, to back up, though, most people in this country, most of the people that we know that we interact with, don't do a very good job of taking care of ourselves, right? I've been guilty of it, and I'm sure all of you have been guilty of it, where maybe you go through a period of life you're just not taking very, very good care of yourself, or maybe you're great, maybe you take excellent care of yourself. But for the most part, I think it's fair to say that most of us don't do a very good job of taking care of ourselves. When we do take care of ourselves, we tend to focus on the body, right? We tend to focus on diet and we focus on exercise. And we say, that is making me healthy, and that is a way for me to take care of myself. And that's certainly true. But I would challenge you a little bit now to ask you to consider. So I'm asking you to consider that taking care of your physical body is really only 1/3 of the job, right? So if you go back to think about what makes us us, right? It's not just the body, it's really the mind and the body and the soul, right? So there's really sort of 3 parts to our overall existence. And when we think about taking care of ourselves, we tend to focus very much on the body, and we tend to forget about that mind part, right? The irony of the whole thing is that as much as we may struggle to get to the gym or struggle to make the right eating decisions, those things would be so much more easy if we just focused instead on the mind and we spent some energy on strengthening our mind so that getting to the gym would actually be easier, making the right eating decisions would actually be easier. And so somehow in our culture along the way, we've sort of missed, you could argue we sort of missed the mark a little bit. There's also the notion that, according to who, or depending on who you listen to, some scientists will say that we have on average 60,000 thoughts a day, right? 70,000 thoughts a day. And that is a whole lot of thinking that's going on, right? But what we don't do a very good job of is managing all of those thoughts. And if you think about in any other area of life or society, if there was 60,000 of anything happening, there would probably be some concerted effort to manage that 60,000 of whatever, right? But here we are every single day, we're having 60,000 thoughts a day. And for the most part, we're not doing a very good job of managing and organizing those thoughts. So we have this clutter of clutter of neurons floating around in our brain and no real effort to being thoughtful about how we think. So the purpose of the framework that I'm going to present to you is to help you be able to sort of manage all those thoughts and give you a way to think about how those thoughts are affecting, as I said, your results. So that's kind of the setup to it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to present this framework in a graphical fashion, just help you sort of visualize this. So I call this the street FAR model. So ST, short for street, and then FAR. This is actually, I did not create this. I have sort of borrowed and repurposed this from another life coach by the name of Brooke Castillo. She calls it CTFAR. I sort of changed the name because I think it's easier to remember it when it's got an acronym that you can easily remember, like street FAR, right? So, and I've added to it a little bit. But basically, some of you have probably already seen very similar models. So this is not original content. There's a lot of other models that are out there that basically get to the same thing. So the idea is that, we have situations in our life that are outside of our control, right? These situations are factual things that happen. And those things that happen can trigger thoughts inside of our mind. Right, so let's go back to the 60,000 thoughts. There's lots of stuff happening in our external world, whether it's the news or whether it is the behavior of another person. A big part of it is our past, so our history, right? Our history is a situation or a circumstance that affects our life, right? And all of those things prompt thoughts. And here's the thing about thoughts, is the thought is not itself a fact. Right, so it's important to sort of think about the distinction between situations and thoughts. And a lot of times it's easy for us to mix those or to conflate those two things. And so I would encourage you to sort of keep top of mind a situation, a behavior, whether it's a coworker's behavior or maybe it's your spouse's behavior, or whether it's something that happens in the news. Those are things that are factual things that occur. And it's not until that you create a description for those things that you have a thought. Think of thoughts as sort of sentences with descriptive words like adjectives and adverbs, right? As soon as you take a situation that happens outside of you and you put some kind of adjective or adverb on it, it now becomes a thought. The thought itself is not the fact, right? The fact is the thing that you don't have control over. As soon as you put an opinion on it, it becomes a thought. And now this is the thing that you do have control over because you're the one that selected the descriptor to put on top of the situation. You guys with me so far? Is this kind of resonating?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So now let's take it one step further. Another thing that we commonly conflate are thoughts versus feelings. And I will be the first person to raise my hand and tell you guilty as charged, because it literally wasn't until about maybe 3 years ago. And again, I'm a middle-aged guy, so I spent many, many years never really appreciating the distinction between thoughts and feelings. And now what I realize that it is such an important thing to be aware of in your sort of everyday practice, okay? Feelings, whereas a thought, I said before, a thought is effectively a sentence that has a descriptive word in it, right? Feelings are emotions. They are things that you feel. When we describe our feelings, they're almost always described with a single word, okay? So the thought is a sentence that has a description. The feeling is one word. It is how you feel as a result of the thought, okay? So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you are having a troubled relationship, and let's go with coworker. Maybe this is your boss, okay? When your boss does X, that is the situation, okay? Your boss did a thing. Now, this might be a thing that the boss does frequently, and it might be a thing that you don't particularly like. So as soon as the boss does the thing, and you say, I don't like that thing, that's the thought that you have. Your thought is, I don't like that thing, that you've put a description on the thing. It's negative. It's a thought that you have. Now, that is distinct from the feeling. When your boss does the thing that you don't like, you're going to have a feeling. Maybe that feeling is anger. Maybe it's frustration, right? That is the one word way to describe the feeling. So you see the two things are really different. One prompts the other, okay? Now let's go to the next sort of line in the model, which is action, inaction, or reaction. Every time we have a feeling, well, I guess not every time, but our feelings that we have, which were the result of the thought, generally would lead to either an action, an inaction, or a reaction, right? So keeping with the example, let's say your boss does the thing which you thought about as being negative, which resulted in your anger. You might say, lash out. Or maybe you will stay quiet, which is an inaction, right? And maybe that then leads to you behaving in an passive aggressive sort of way, right? Or you could have a reaction, which I guess in this example is kind of the same as the action. Maybe your reaction is that you lash out, or maybe you shut down, whatever it is. These are the actions that are coming from your feelings of anger. So in this example, what do you think might be the result of my action, inaction, or reaction? Well, the result is going to be that there is a strained relationship, right? And maybe due to this strained relationship down the road, I failed to get a promotion. So the result is a failure to get a promotion. And then here's where we loop back around. That result of me not getting a promotion comes back to reinforce the original thought, right? The original thought was that my boss is a jerk. And now I've proven that to myself because I failed to get a promotion. So you can see that this is kind of how the sequence of things that occur from a single situation. So are you guys still with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, this is great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, having said all of that, here's the thing. Because you might say, this is all nice and good, Dale. Makes sense. But what the hell do I do with it? So here's the thing. I want to go back to where I sort of started when I was talking about, we've got 60,000 thoughts in our head any given day. And we generally don't do a very good job of taking care of our brains. We might go to the gym and take care of our body, but we don't take care of our brain. Okay, here's the thing. Taking good care of your brain is actually just as hard as taking care of your body. I want you to think of your brain like a muscle, right? So just like going to the gym to, say, increase your bicep strength, you can't expect to go and do a couple of curls with some dumbbells and all of a sudden you have a stronger bicep. It doesn't work like that, right? You have to go and repeat the exercise for a period of time and get stronger and stronger. And when you go to the gym 30 days, 45 days regularly, twice a week for a year, eventually you have a stronger bicep. Well, the mind is the same thing. All of the thought patterns that we have in our head have been in our head for a long time, right? So those 60,000 thoughts, the thing about those 60,000 thoughts is you have to realize that most of those 60,000 thoughts that you have every single day are the same thoughts that you had yesterday, right? Do you guys see this in your life? Does it make sense that, the thought patterns I'm going to have, the reactions and the thoughts and feelings that I'm going to have in reaction to the situations in my life, they're probably going to repeat themselves, right? So we have these thought patterns that become wired in our brain. The good news is that there is a thing that you probably have heard of recently called neuroplasticity, right? And this is a new thing that scientists are learning a lot more about than we ever did before. I certainly was never taught this when I was a kid because I don't think the word even existed when I was a kid. When we were kids. But neuroplasticity is the idea that you actually can create new neurons and new neural networks inside of your brain. You can create new thought patterns. But in order to do that, you actually have to do the work. So just like going to the gym to build big biceps and pecs, you have to work your mind and you have to repeat exercises inside of your head to create new and better thought patterns. Okay. This is the good news. So it can get better. You just have to be willing to do the work. Now, if you're not willing to do the work, you're probably not going to get the results. Okay. And the thing about doing the work is that it requires conscious effort and it requires a willingness to fail. You're going to fail a lot before you start to succeed. Okay. And I'll give you a personal example. So on my journey, so I mentioned having gone through a major illness. After I got better, I discovered that stress was a big part of what caused my illness. And a big part of my stress was not just my job that I had at the time, but also it was my mindset. I had a lot of baggage from my past. I didn't have exactly the most wonderful childhood. And I actually had I had a lot of negativity that if you knew me, you probably never would see, right? Because it wasn't something that I wore externally, but it was a lot of just junk and crap. that was sitting there that was creating stress in my life that I was never really aware of. And so when I realized that that was having an impact on my physical health, I started to do something about it. And what I realized is that it took a while, right? So I would have this sort of awareness that I was having thoughts which were resulting in feelings. And every now and then I would recognize the thought and then I would try to do something about it. But it took a while. I would forget. I would forget this whole model. I would forget because I was so wired in the old thought patterns. And this is going to happen to all of us, right? Because remember, you've had the same thoughts over and over and over again, in many cases for years and years and years and years, right? So while it is possible to unwire and rewire, it just takes a little bit of effort. So when you start to use this model in your everyday life to try to get better results, you have to recognize that it is going to take a while and that you're going to have a lot of failures to begin with. But if you can just have the grace and a little bit of patience for yourself, and if you just stick to it, you will absolutely start to see results, because it worked for me and it took a while. And I will give you an example with me. So several of you here have talked about having kids. Okay. So one of the things that would drive me crazy about my kids is the leaving of the shoes all over the house. Okay. And you probably all have experienced this. And I don't know why this bugged me so much, but every time I walk in any room of my house, invariably there will be 14 pairs of shoes strewn about the room. And it would drive me nuts. And I would always get irritated, angry, and I would shout at the kids and say, why aren't you putting, the shoes away? And what I found is every time I would see a pair of shoes, the thought that occurred in my mind was something along the lines of, why don't they listen to me? It wasn't even about the shoes being on the floor or the inconvenience of the shoes being on the floor. It was about, why aren't they respecting me? I've asked them a million times to put the shoes away. Why are they not putting the shoes away? That thought led to a feeling of anger, right? It led to a feeling of being disrespected. And when I was able to recognize this, the first step in the process is to try to figure out where that thought is actually coming from. Because again, remember, we are wired with the same thoughts over and over and over again. And oftentimes those thoughts have an origin that goes way back, right? So for me, that particular thought of being ignored or not being listened to actually went as far back as my childhood. So being able to recognize that was a huge step forward, and being able to say, holy shit, I now get why this is my default thought that I'm having automatically. And I can recognize where it's coming from. And so now that I recognize the source of it, it is much easier for me to decide to dismiss it and instead choose a different thought, which will result in a different feeling, which will create better results. So this is what I did for a while. It took a few months. One day I walked into the house, it was in the kitchen, and there was like 3 pairs of shoes in the kitchen. And so I looked at them, I bent down, I picked them up, and I moved them aside. And then I went on my business. And about 5 minutes later, I realized what had just happened. I thought, holy shit, I put the shoes away and didn't have any anger. There was no frustration. There was no reaction to it. I just moved them aside and everything was fine. What was happening was, rather than have the thought that I'm being disrespected or my kids don't listen to me, I had the thought that, let's just move the shoes out of the way so nobody trips on them. And then my feeling from that thought was one of neutrality. There was no emotion, really. It was just a thing that happened and there was no feelings. And so the action was, I moved the shoes aside, and the result was my kids came into the room and I didn't yell at them. Right? So that's really kind of how the process works. So let me get into the next slide here, is kind of a little further of a little bit of a deep dive. So how to change the thoughts. You'll notice, yeah, Steve.
So did they start picking up their shoes? Sorry,
No.
I just
No,
No,
they still do not pick up their shoes. It's maybe gotten a little bit better. In fact, just it's not just the kids, by the way. So some of you know my wife. It's not just the kids that are leaving the shoes all over the place, but it certainly does not bother me anymore. And it is, and it may seem like a small trivial thing, and in some ways it is a small trivial thing. But I use this example because number one, it goes back to figuring out what the source of the thought was. Right. And in this particular example, the two different results are very clear. So even though this might sound like a trivial thing, this actually works with much less trivial things as well. Now, the reason I put a little red flag by the word thoughts here is because I want you to think about this red flag concept. What I want you to think about is pretend that you have a radar, right? As you live your life and as you're going through your everyday activities, I want you to sort of imagine that you have a radar, and picture the old school, like that sweeping hand that goes around on the digital screen, like it's on a spaceship or on an airplane or something, right? And this radar is constantly monitoring your brain. And when it catches a thought that is going to, result in a feeling that you don't really want, I want you to imagine a red flag popping up. And sort of get into the practice of doing this. And again, it's going to take a while, but train yourself to recognize those thoughts as a red flag. As soon as the red flag pops up, what do you do? So I have this little acronym that I use. There's two steps to it. Step number one is this little acronym I call NIA. Okay, so first you notice the thought. So that's the red flag popping up. Notice the thought and then inquire about the thought. So don't judge the thought. Don't, think poorly of yourself because you had the thought. Simply figure out what is the source of this thought. Why am I having this thought? So in my example, in the case of the shoes, I found that the source of the thought had to go back to my feelings of being ignored or disrespected as a child. Okay. And it made it through, 40 years into my adult life. So inquire about the thought. And it may not be that you necessarily need to find the source of it. It might be something that's much more present. It could be something that maybe you're just in a bad mood, or maybe something happened the day before, or whatever it is. But just notice the thought and then inquire, what is the thought? Because that's really helpful. It's very therapeutic for you to then be able to say, this thought is actually not my fault. This thought that I'm having is not something I'm doing wrong. I have no judgment for myself about having this thought because it's just a thought that came to me because of the other thing. And that is a really sort of refreshing thing because now you can say, I can simply dismiss it. It's not part of me. It doesn't belong to me. In my case, I had this thing from my childhood. Well, that has no bearing on me today. That's in the past. In the past, I can't change. So regardless of how I feel that I was treated in the past, those are just my judgments of it. Let me just let that go. It doesn't belong to me. So you notice it, you inquire it, and then you get to the last step, which is accept that it doesn't serve, right? So this is the A part. And when you accept that that thought doesn't serve you anymore, you now can say, I'm going to have a better thought. Realize that you always have a suite of options. It's like anytime there is a situation that occurs and you're going to have a thought about the situation, you actually have a menu of thoughts to choose from. So let's say it's your boss again. Your boss does the thing that you would have had a thought, I didn't like the thing he did. So red flag pops up, boss does the thing, red flag, you have the radar. I notice that I'm now about to think my boss is a jerk because he did the thing. But actually, I have several other choices I can make in my thinking. For example, I might think, I wonder if he's having a shitty day. If your thought was, I wonder if the boss is having a shitty day, as opposed to my boss is a jerk, then the feeling that results from that is probably not going to be anger. It might actually be, kindness or consideration or empathy, which obviously is going to get to a different result, right? So you always have a choice of thoughts that you can take in response to any given situation. So when the red flag comes up, you're going to notice it and then consider your choice of options for what to think, make a better choice. So once you get to that, for the first time and you start getting into the practice, you go to step 2. So this is now where you have to go to the gym over and over again. Okay. Because rewiring that new thought is not going to happen instantly, because very likely the very next day when your boss does the thing that previously pissed you off, you're going to forget all of this and you're probably going to get pissed off again. But then maybe the third day you recognize it and now you are more conscious of it and you make a better choice and so on and so forth. And it's going to take a while, right? So you go through this cycle of watching for the old thought like a radar and then choosing a new thought progressively. Now, what have I said the word progressively? So here's the thing. It's not always that easy to just accept the new thought. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. Let's say that you are struggling with your weight. Okay. You might, in response to, you may say, step on the scale, and you read the number on the scale and it says you're 30 pounds heavier than you want to be. Now, at this point, you have a couple of options of how to think about that. One thought might be, I'm fat and ugly and I don't like my body. Okay. Now, the better thought to that, your first choice for a better thought might be something like, I love my body. I look great. I have 6-pack abs. I am awesome. Now, here's the thing. That sounds like a better choice, and it probably is, but you're probably not going to actually believe it. If you are in fact 30 pounds overweight, for you to try to tell yourself that you look great and you have 6-pack abs, that's just not going to ring true, right? So if your brain is not going to actually believe it, then that's probably not the right thought to choose. So instead, what we do is we progressively choose new thoughts. So let's say you step on the scale, you're 30 pounds overweight. You're not going to tell yourself, I look great and I have 6-pack abs. But you might say, rather than say, I'm fat and I'm ugly, you might go with, my body functions. So the thought now is something that is neutral. It is, or maybe even less negative than the previous thought. It's not quite a positive thought yet, but it's stepwise. When you, if you were to say to yourself, my body functions, that is believable. Your brain can accept that. And so you're much more likely to believe that thought and then move on to a better feeling of yourself. Maybe you're going to have a neutral feeling, or maybe you'll have a less negative feeling than if you had said to yourself that I'm fat and ugly, right? Once you get back into the pattern of that thinking that my body is adequate and my body functions, and you get on that for a while, maybe you lose a little bit of weight. Now the next thought is upgrade that thought to something more positive, right? So now your thought might be, hey, I'm looking a little bit better, and so on and so forth. And then eventually you get to the thought, man, I look hot. I'm 6-pack abs, right? So it's important that whatever the new thought is, it has to be something that is believable and that your brain will actually accept. And so that's really kind of how it works. Now, again, it sounds like a lot of work, right? And it does sound like it's going to be very hard to constantly run that radar that is monitoring for negative thoughts. And it is. But once you start getting into the practice of it, it does become a lot easier. And so what I would like to challenge you guys to do is pick one thing. And if you want, you can write it down right now. Pick one situation in your life for which you would like to have a different result. It can be a relationship thing. It can be a job thing. It can be a money thing. It can be a health thing, whatever it is. Pick an area of your life. Pick one thing where you would like to have a different result, and then write it down and work the model. So you have 5 lines on a piece of paper: situation, thoughts, feelings, action, and results. And put this thing in the context of this model. Now, obviously, so Jeff, you're driving. I get it. You can do this later. But just to sort of keep you guys honest, you don't have to go through the whole model right now while we're on the call, but at least write down the thing that you would like to work on. And then you can come back later and put it in the context of this model. And what I would say is take this one thing, apply this process, and see if over time you can get to a healthier thought and a different result. And just do it as sort of an experiment. I'm not asking you to go change every area of your life using this right now. I'm asking you to just take a little baby step, pick one thing, use the model, try it over, say, I don't know, 15 days, 30 days, depending on how big a thing it is, and see if you can rewire your brain for a better thought.